Okay, we'll do intros in a second, but we're going to start by kicking off with something we're going to refer to throughout this call today before we do intros, and that is this equation here. This is called the trust equation from a book called The Trusted Advisor. It's one that we refer to often with teams we work with for the consulting company we run. But in terms of talking about designers and product managers and working together, this is key. And so the trust equation has four factors because a lot of times we talk about trust being this really nebulous big thing. But the four factors of trust are number one, credibility, number two, reliability, and then number three, intimacy, and number four, perceived self-interest. And the reason these are all critical is instead of saying, well, do we trust each other? You know, how could we trust each other more? Now we have specific elements that we can talk about. And today, as Devin and I talk, we'll get into each of these and how these elements can impact work between designers and product managers. So with that, Devin, why don't you I guess I'll introduce myself and then I'll hand it off to you. My name is Ryan Siemens. My background is in product management. Started in product at LinkedIn. Was at a company called Degreed, where Devin and I met, and we worked together for a few years as a designer and product manager. And now we get to work together again in the company we run today called Sprintwell. So excited to be here and talking to Devin about this. Devin, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we can get in to the topic for the day.
Great. Good to see everybody. My name is Devin, as Ryan has said. I have been doing user experience design or product design for about 10 years, from everything from freelance work to working at large enterprises, working on web and mobile. And as Ryan said, worked together with him at Degreed, which is probably the company I've been at the longest, and now most recently here at Sprintwell. So excited to have this conversation today.
Perfect. Well, I think three topics we're going to talk about today, right? Roles and responsibilities, process and communication, and trust. But I'm curious, why did the topic even, I mean, we started talking about this, I don't know, a week or two ago. Curious why it even kind of came up in your mind.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about, as I was thinking about product teams in general, I don't know if there's a relationship that can steer the success of a team more than the relationship between a PM and a designer. And maybe that's a biased viewpoint, but it really has a huge impact on the speed of delivery, the quality of the product, and just the overall kind of tone of the team, at least in my experience. But I don't know, what are your thoughts, Ryan?
Yeah, I think I know when I think about the designers I've worked with in that relationship, one, it's an easy relationship to start to blame, to say, design didn't do this, and that's why, like, the designer wants this or that, and vice versa, right? Designer saying, well, the PM, we had the designs, but the PM messed them all up. While development and working with development team, kind of that trifecta of product design or product development and building products, product management, designers, development. Well, development is key. The partnership between product and design is so critical, and I think an easy one to mess up at times. Which is why I think starting with the roles is critical to understand, well, what are the roles and how should you work together, and what about overlapping skill sets and all of those pieces?
So Ryan, you've probably worked at more companies than I have. Have you seen any sort of consistency between the roles of a PM versus the roles of a designer, or does it tend to shift between teams and individuals? You know, what's kind of your read on that?
Yeah, this is really challenging for the role of a product manager. I think I guess I shouldn't even say more so than a designer. I'm already getting into designers have it easy. For product managers, you know, a PM means so many different things. Sometimes it can mean someone who deals more with the marketing and the customer facing things. Sometimes it means someone who's actually was an engineer and is pretty technical and can really manage all the technical work. Sometimes it's someone who's really business oriented and manages internal stakeholders. So given the wide variety of backgrounds that product managers can come from, and just what product manager even means at companies, it really differs company to company how a PM needs to work with a designer. I mean, sometimes they don't even have a designer, or sometimes they have a whole design team. Yeah, so it can be really eclectic depending on company size, team size, and just the way companies approach things. Have you found the same for design as you've worked at different companies as a designer?
I have had a very similar experience to you, and I'm gonna use a really terrible pun here, but it's really kind of nice to have a blank canvas. Design joke. Um, when you're kind of thinking about the relationship between you and a PM, right? Because it really is yours to make what you want it to be. Um, I think, and as we start talking about different roles and responsibilities, I think it's good to go into realizing that both user experience design and product management are such broad. There's such broad roles, and there's a number of different specializations within each of those roles, and some of those overlap, and some of them don't. But there's so much work to do, and there's so much between those two roles. You really do have to kind of work together to figure out like who's going to do what, and what are the things that you're interested in as an individual. What are the things your partner is interested in, and how can you make that a synergistic experience for everybody? But to your point, I mean, I've even within the same company, we talked about degree. You and I had a very interesting dynamic that we'll probably get into in more detail. That I had other product managers who were not interested in
Hmm.
my more PM leaning skill sets and were more interested in having me be focused on visual design and just making things look pretty. So there's definitely kind of some work.
Yeah, there is some work to do. I think one thing that I really one thing that I really struggle with at times. Oh, I think we're cutting you out right now. One thing that I really struggle with at times when you think about designers and PMs is, yeah, just the expectations of, well, what can I count on you for? What am I going to be doing? And how can we think about that? So I think, and this is a model that I like to use when I'm trying to teach product managers and designers to work together. And I think curious to get your reaction to this. I think it's worked well for us. But it's this idea of the junior and the senior. That the junior that the senior, the person whose main role it is, say with product, if I'm the product manager, I'm the senior on the project for that. I should be the one who's putting forth, the one primarily responsible. I'm doing things like talking to users and gathering insights into what do we need to build and helping us define product vision and doing that. But that said, I think the best teams, they work together. So a designer and a PM, the designer can act as a junior to them. So that I want a designer who is contributing to that and giving good feedback around that, and being a real partner in that. And I think vice versa on the design side, I want to work with a designer who's a senior designer, someone who's putting forth and really is leading out when it comes to design. But I'd love to be considered a junior designer. Them. I want to give feedback. I want my opinion to be heard, and I want to be able to help out and just know that we're partnering and contributing on that. I think that type of a relationship where you can truly be together on something is powerful. But it takes a lot to get that kind of relationship. So let's see, Devin, I think I might be losing you. So we may have you call back in. I may explain a little bit more about this. Let me take you off video. Devin, you still there?
Yeah, yeah. So, can you hear me?
Yeah, barely. So I'll let you figure that out, and I'll describe kind of the senior junior in the model that we think about to establish that kind of relationship that can be helpful while you're figuring out reception. So when you work
Yeah,
together in
can you
oh, sorry, you back?
back hear me? Can you
Yep. Sorry, it's cutting out. There we go. So as we think about designer and this idea of a senior and a junior, something that's powerful is setting expectations. And so an exercise you can do with your product manager or designer, see if Devin calls back in. An exercise you can do with your product manager or designer on a team. There you go, Devin, I think you're on the phone. It can be incredibly helpful to sit and just talk about, well, what do we expect from each other? Where do we even want to align on this together? And do you want my feedback on certain things or do you not? And so even just starting that conversation is really helpful, because a lot of, the worst thing you can do is start to work together and just assume, oh, it's going to be like a team I worked on before. Or it's going to be like I see another team working at it at my company. And the problem is when you have misaligned expectations and the designer or the PM thinks they're going to contribute to something and then they don't. That can be particularly painful. Devin, are you back? I'd love to hear your comment on that. I don't think you are. Let me see if I can get him back because I really want to hear Devin's thoughts on this. While we're waiting for Devin, one other question that we've heard before in terms of PMs and designers and roles working together are the skills themselves. So thinking about, well, what skills are required to be able to, I'm glad you can see and hear me. What skills are required? What do you expect from your designer in terms of skills? And what do you expect from your PM in terms of skills? Oh, one sec. I'll keep talking about this as we get Devin back on. For some reason, it is not working very well. Oh, Devin, looks like I can see you again. Are you here? This is the joy of doing live. We tested this yesterday and it worked really well. Of course, today it's not working. Cool, Devin, I'll let you keep experimenting with that. The key, so a key piece with skills, you think about that question of, well, what skills do I expect my product manager and designer to have? And for me, the critical part of this answer is that it's not, there is no answer of, you need to have this skill. I mean, we can talk about skills that are helpful to have and helpful to use. But for me, the key is, let's just make sure we talk about what skills we need to have and use, and make sure I understand, well, what skills do you have and where can you contribute, or what do you want to contribute? And vice versa. If I'm working with a designer, I want to know where I can contribute. And if there's a designer who has some skills where they can contribute to more than just the visual design, they can do user research, they can talk to users, they understand analytics and can spec out what analytics would look like. That means that we can partner in a way that is very different. Devin, do we have you here? Looks like not. Okay. Well, trying to get Devin back on. Again, the three things that we think product managers and designers can do together. I mean, one is this roles and responsibilities. And again, my biggest advice is be clear about who's doing what role and what you expect of each other. That there is not really a right answer to that, but that it's important to make sure that you are aligned. The second thing is you think about process and communication. A few questions that we've heard before that we can cover. Things like, how do you make decisions? Who gets to make the final call? What are some attributes that designers appreciate most about PMs, and vice versa, PMs about designers? And just thinking about how you communicate and talk to each other. I think, again, a key piece is to make sure that you get in a good cadence of communicating and talking and asking and answering questions. When you first start the relationship, or today, I mean, if you're already a PM and a designer in a relationship working together, making sure that you're clear on, well, how often should we talk? When should we talk? And what should we talk about? Again, it's easy to get into that and just start going and say, okay, well, we'll just talk when we need. And then it gets easy for a week to go by, and oh, we haven't talked, and oh, what are you working on? What am I working on? Why didn't this get done? Ideally, if you are full time on a team as a PM and designer, you are communicating regularly, ideally every day or two, and working on that together. And so if you are in a relationship today, and if that isn't going well, I'd encourage you to talk about that and just say, hey, it's been a while since we talked about this. How could we work together better? And what could we do, or where could we sync? And, where would that be helpful so that we're aligned and we're giving good input to each other, but we're not stepping on each other's toes, and figure out what's right for you. And in terms of communication, the attributes, I can talk about, again, I think we're trying to get Evan back on, but I can talk about the attributes of designers that I really appreciate. When I, as a product manager, the designers I most appreciate, when I've been working together, they're designers who are, they care about more than just the visual pixels, where they're not just going to be making pretty pictures, but they say, hey, we're aligned on what we want to achieve together. We want customers to get great value. But maybe, we have different roles to play in getting that. So being able to have a shared end goal, I think, is critical for how a PM and designer can work together. And for me, the best designers I've worked with always align there and then say, great, now which parts and which skills are we going to have? What are each of us going to do to that point? So Devin, good to have you back.
Can you hear me now too?
Yeah, we can hear you now. It's great.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's what happens with live. Yeah, I take back what I said yesterday about Skype, where we were like, oh, this is actually pretty good. But yeah, it's all good. So I was jumping into some of the process and communication stuff. We can go back to roles and responsibilities. But yeah, curious as I was talking, I know a lot for you to react to, but yeah, curious any of your take on the roles and responsibilities, anything that we missed and should cover. And then we can talk more about communication, just good strategies for PMs and designers to communicate.
Yeah. So the one thing that I don't know if you hit on that I think is critical is that if a designer and a PM are not territorial, it goes a long way because there's so much to do. And I think the way that you and I work together is actually a great example of this. I am not I'm not the best visual designer. I don't get caught up in the pixels. I'm more interested in kind of solving the problems and figuring out the architecture and some of the strategy stuff. And so I would, a different PM could have easily seen me as being kind of encroaching on territory. I was creating kind of research docs and jumping into meetings that you were having with people. And I was interested in helping to solve those problems. And kind of to your metaphor earlier, I was kind of pretending to be the junior PM. But then I think on the flip side, I also felt like I didn't prevent you from doing design things. You would share ideas or sketch things, and I think as a designer, sometimes there's this pressure that you have to be the one coming up with the creative innovation. The longer I got into my career, the more I started kind of ignoring that pressure and realizing as a designer, your job isn't to come up with all the innovation, it's to curate the innovation. You should be able to recognize a good idea, whether it comes from a PM or a customer or a developer. You need to be able to recognize that and then execute it and pull it into a system. And so there really is no benefit or need to be so territorial about, well, I'm a designer, I do this, or you're a PM, I do that. It's really an opportunity for each of us to kind of learn different skill sets, try new things, and really, if you're a partnership and you are interested in what the other person cares about, which you should, that should be an open dialogue and say, hey, this is something I'm interested in doing more of. Can I help with this? I'm not a big fan of doing this particular kind of work. Is this something that you would like picking up, or should we split it so that we're kind of sharing some of the burden? I think removing that territorial attitude helps a lot with kind of the roles and responsibilities discussion.
Yeah,
That's it.
I completely agree. I think it reminds me of that idea that when you don't care who gets the credit for what happens, it's amazing what you can get done as a team. And it's hard because I think it's important as a product team to recognize who's doing what and to make sure people are recognized for the effort they put forward. But yeah, territorialism from PMs and designers doesn't help anyone and can really tank a team. So I appreciate you pointing that out. Anything else before we move on to communication?
One question I had for you from your perspective, and maybe you already touched on this. If you have, you can just tell me to watch the recording. um, but I think a lot of designers want to be more strategic and they want to be more involved early on in the process. How what can designers do to get that or earn that, or I don't know what the right word is there, but how can designers become more strategic and play and participate in that kind of early part of the process?
Yeah, great question. I think the one way that I think designers can get more involved in the early strategic process is one to not to jump in headlong of like, okay, I'm here, I'm going to answer all these questions, but to approach it with that attitude of, hey, how can I help? Which one of my favorite questions is, what could I do to be helpful to you? That, hey, I see all the things you're doing. That's all great. Like, hey, what could I do to be helpful? And if there's something you want to do that you think could contribute, you can offer that and say, like your example with research docs, which not all designers want to do and not all designers feel like they should do. But you said, hey, do you need help with this? What if I went off and researched this? And I could either say, no, I got that. That's my thing. Or I could say, actually, yeah, that would be really helpful. So that question of what could I do to help? I think that's helpful from a designer to a PM, and I think vice versa. When I see designs, great. Well, what feedback are you looking for? What can I say that would be helpful here? How can I really be helpful? I think that's all very key. And it's this attitude that makes for a good partnership. And that's with, again, the PMs and design teams that I see and some of the PMs that I coach. Most of the problems come from attitude, and it's not just one person. I mean, sometimes there's a competence issue of someone's not able to do something, but it's this attitude of, hey, I got to do this either because they're arrogant or they're under pressure and they feel like they have to. But as you get more of this attitude of partnership, it can be really, really great.
I agree. Cool. Well, didn't mean to derail us from from the other parts of the conversation. Um, so, what were we talking about in terms of kind of our next section with trust? And this is a big one.
Yeah, trust is a big one because I mean, we talk about the roles and responsibilities, we talk about process and communication, and I mean, a lot of it comes down to, well, do we trust each other? Do we believe that we have our best intentions, of each other? Can we really rely on each other, or are you someone that I have to manage and work around? And I guess I'll share this trust equation one more time up on the screen. For those who weren't here at the beginning, this is helpful to see. For me, a key part of this is perceived self-interest. So you think about how you work together, and if you think that someone is doing something only because it's going to benefit them, it can just kill the conversation, right? It makes you feel really vulnerable. And I'm sure you've probably seen and felt that as a designer at times.
And then they just get bigger. They tend to kind of grow and get bigger and bigger over time, right? When there becomes a trust issue, everything else just gets that much harder. And sometimes it comes down to, like you say, kind of that the perception of what people care about. I know that the one thing that designers often struggle with is they feel like PMs don't care about design.
Yeah.
And you're laughing. There's a knowing laugh there.
There is.
I guess and it's kind of an interesting dilemma. But I guess let's just ask this: do PMs care about design? Maybe they don't. Do they?
Yeah, and what's funny is I always say like, of course I do. I care about design, but we don't always with designers I've worked with, we don't always agree on, well, what does design mean and what parts of design? I mean, obviously design is how it works and functions, how we're delivering solutions to customers. But then it's, well, what about the colors? What about the logo? What about the fonts? What's hard is that at times as a PM, it's easy to say, that doesn't matter. Like, let's just go forward. Put anything there. But then I think about some of the best design solutions, and I know that a lot of thought and care has been put into those things. So sometimes it can be tricky because I want to work with a designer who advocates for the right things that are going to have impact on a customer. But then it's easy at times to feel like, well, the designer just wants to make pretty pictures and look, I want to change the world. Like, who cares about the picture? Like, let's move forward. So it can be a difficult thing to balance. I know that I've personally have struggled with that at times with designers I've worked with.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things that designers can do better in this space. One is realizing that PMs are sitting between a cross section of feedback that includes design. They're hearing the design feedback, but they're also hearing from the developers that there's several bugs that need to be fixed, and the architecture is under stress, and then they've got pressure from the business in terms of delivering on time, and there might be customer feedback or even like customer service. PMs have to balance a variety of different inputs and feedback, and design is really just one of them.
Yep.
And I think it's helpful for designers to recognize and understand that. And to your point earlier about kind of having this attitude of where can I help, if you can use your design skills to help a product manager navigate those things and get some design wins, I think that goes a long way. Then the second thing I would advocate for is that designers could be better at designing with intention and understanding why certain design decisions are important to what their impact is. Because I think a lot of designers intuitively know which designs look better and feel better, but they don't necessarily correlate that to impact, business impact, experience impact, or even just design debt, which is a real thing, just like tech debt. It needs to be managed and kind of worked against. But I think designers can do better at understanding, instead of just saying, I picked this color because I like it, or we need to get away from having all these different button styles. We've got seven different button styles across the app, and it's getting confusing. Be able to articulate why it matters and why we should do this now instead of tackling some new feature or tackling some sort of tech debt or security issue or customer request. I think that would help.
Yeah. For me, that it's super helpful when a designer says, hey, here's an idea I have, here's something that I want to do, but here's why, here's the impact that it's going to have either today or in the future. And on the flip side, I think it's important for PMs to ask questions and not just to dismiss, not just to have the arrogance of like, oh, I know what needs to happen. Like, yeah, that's not on the roadmap. Get out of here. But to say, okay, well, hey, because I think a lot of designers I've worked with tend to be more intuitive about, I feel like this is important than some PMs who are more like, well, show me the evidence and let's follow that. And I think both can be really helpful to say, hey, you've got a hunch about something. Why? Like what point of user feedback made you feel that way? Or what have you seen in terms of other apps that we should understand a pattern out there that's working and why that's working? What did you see when we did the UX testing or the integration testing that we really need to understand, oh, we should do that and here's why we need to do that. So PMs can, I think, be a little more patient to ask questions, understand, and just have respect back and forth. Which part, as we talk about the trust equation, we talked about perceived self-interest, that is undermining the relationship. But something that can add to it is intimacy, which isn't a word we usually talk about at work, but intimacy is being able to understand each other and feel like we're real people. We have real conversations, including potentially things outside of understanding who we are as people outside of work. Those can all help because then instead of assuming we know what each other means, or instead of getting ruffled of like, we can't talk about this, we say, no, let's talk about this. We're not aligned right now. And I think you and I, in the work we've done over the years, have had a number of times where we didn't agree on something. You thought one way, I thought another way. And it would be easy either for one of us to kind of just rear up and say, no, well, I'm the PM, I'm the designer, like it is this way. But instead, if you have a good relationship of communication, then you can sit and talk through like, well, okay, help me I don't understand it yet. I'm sure you have a good reason. Like, let's understand it. And that doesn't always mean we do one way or the other, but we talk it out and try to understand. Because again, it's a partnership, and I think that's the best way to view it.
It is, and one of the principles we had at Degreed, which I love, so full credit to them, was have strong opinions held loosely.
Yeah.
And I think that was something that I think, especially in this PM designer role, is really important and critical. I think the people that I respect the most, who I work with, are the ones who I can debate with, and they can be heated debates. I mean, there's people that I have worked with that, I mean, it's almost full on yelling matches, but then you can wrap it up and go get lunch, and there's a separation between you as the individual and the work that you're doing. And maybe not everyone, and I'm not saying you have to be able to get to that level of conflict, but you need to be able to separate what you're doing is what you're working on together as a team. It's not who you are as an individual. There's no reason to be offended if your PM doesn't like your design. There's no reason to be offended if the designer thinks your roadmap sucks. Like, it's not a personal hit or attack. And then being able to change your mind if you get better information. I think back on when you and I worked together, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I actually don't think we ever moved forward on anything where we weren't in agreement. Because I think, and I'd be interested to see if you've come up with any, but because I think that when we had our disagreements, we would talk it out, and I would explain my reasoning and you would explain your reasoning. And at the end of that conversation, one of us would realize, you know what you're saying makes more sense right now, given where we're at, given whatever it is. Yeah, let's go with that for now. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we were happy about it, but we knew it was the right decision at that moment. I can't think of a time where we weren't able to move forward without consensus.
Yeah.
With you and I, at least.
Yeah, I think that's the case. For me, it hasn't always been that way with designers, but I think for you and I, we developed a relationship that we could do that. And I think while not everyone's going to be able to have a design PM relationship like that, I think knowing that that's possible, and that it means you don't always agree at first. Like, we had plenty of things we disagreed about, but that as you show respect, talk it out, that can be really really helpful. And I think the goal, what's hard is you can't change the other person, right? I mean, it's kind of like any relationship, a marriage or anything else. Like, you can only change you, but to come in with respect and expecting respect, I think can be really powerful. Yeah. So I'm curious from your end, as I think about what you asked me, how do you think you can get PMs to care more about design? Given that it seems like something that PMs should care about, and depending on your product and how big of a role design plays in the product. But what do you think PMs need to understand to better appreciate design and care about it?
And this probably gets a little bit into communication, but I think it, with anything, whenever you're trying to kind of help someone see your perspective, you need to understand what their underlying goals are and help tie in whatever you're trying to do to their goals. So I think PMs tend to be more focused on outcomes and delivery and business impact and metrics and things in that realm. And I think each designer is going to be a little bit unique. Maybe there's a designer who's under a lot of pressure to crank out a lot of new features really, really quickly for launch. Or maybe there's another designer whose job is literally on the line if they don't bring up MAU within the next 6 months. Like, that might literally be a PM's work situation.
Yeah.
And so how can you correlate design into what it is that the PM is trying to accomplish? And it does. That's the thing, is that it's not like it's a stretch, and it's not like you have to really it's not like you really have to put a lot of spin on design, because design is what supports the products that we build.
Yep.
and those things do have an impact and they matter. So being able to translate what you see from a designer's vision and perspective into what it is that the PM cares about and will help them to meet their objectives and their goals. I think is how you do it. I don't think I don't think it's probably likely or possible or even helpful to get a product manager to like hang out on Dribbble and get really excited about the perfect corner radiuses on buttons and whether or not you're I just don't think that's really helpful. Like that's the designer's world to care about and worry about. But translate that into things that matter to the PM, I think, is how you get them to care about design.
Cool. Love it. Yeah. Because as you're talking about business impact, shipping, I'm like, yeah, all these things are important. And yeah, if we go through your Dribbble portfolio, I might think it's cool. I'm like, yeah, wow, that looks awesome. But for me especially, I don't always appreciate the nuance of the radius on corners of buttons. And I think this goes both ways for designers, PMs, as well as for customers to know that just because I care about it doesn't mean someone else will. And I need to understand what is important to them and talk with them and ask them questions and then be able to say, okay, if they're not aligned with me, there's something that's important to them that I'm not understanding, or I haven't articulated something that I think they should care about. And so it's important to spend time on that.
So there was one question that someone sent to me ahead of time. They had a situation where they were the designer and they were working with the PM, and there was just a disagreement over how to move forward on a particular feature. The designer thought it should work one way, the PM thought it should work another way. How do you think a situation like that should be reconciled? Like, do PMs have a trump card over designers? And if so, when should they play it and when shouldn't they?
Yeah, that's a good question, a hard question, because my first reaction is like, well, yeah, if you don't like this, like I'm just gonna pull the trump card. I think in general, in the way that most product teams are set up, the PM likely does have a trump card in terms of decision making of, well, what are we going to decide moving forward? It depends a lot, again, on the structure of the organization, if the product organization or the design organization has more power. But that said, I think the best way is actually not to use that. And to be very cautious and careful about using that. Because as soon as you establish that precedent of, well, we're going to talk, we disagree, okay, we're doing it this way. It's a bad way to manage. It's a bad way to work. And if you do have to do it, either just to make the call to say, look, we just don't agree and people aren't budging. And for someone to say, look, to talk it out and say, I appreciate where you're coming from. I understand you're advocating for this. I understand what you're saying, but we're going to make this decision, and this is why, and here's what we're going to do in the future. I think that's critical because it's easy, and this has been perpetuated by the, I think, false idea that the PM is the CEO of the product. And when the PM thinks they're the CEO of the product, then they just say, cool, okay, well, Trump, here's my Trump card. I'm the CEO. I can just make the calls. And the problem is that you end up losing the hearts and minds of the people on your team. And that can go vice versa as well. If the designer says, well, look, I've kind of got power. Design is really respected in our org, and I'm just going to tell you how it is. You have to go build it. That can make life pretty miserable for a PM and a dev team. So being able to understand each other, talk it out, and to know that sometimes one of us is going to have to decide if we don't agree, and that's okay.
Yeah. I don't think we considered talking about this, but you brought up a point there that I think is interesting, and that PMs are in a really kind of strange role because in most organizations, a PM is, at least from an org chart, like a seating chart. Yep. They're peers with designers, but they kind of act like pseudo people managers too sometimes because they kind of sit in the cross section of all these places, and not every PM has developed those people leadership skills, I would imagine.
Yeah.
But yet they're kind of in this position of power and influence. So I don't think I have necessarily a question. That was just an observation. I'm sure you'll react to, but I think it's an interesting thing to just think about. You know, if you're a designer who's more senior and you kind of know what's going on, I think it's okay to kind of shadow coach through some of that and just recognize that the PM is probably managing things that are outside of their job role. Like a lot of PMs get into PM through development or QA or you know some other, or maybe they got their MBA or something. You know, it's not a clear path into product management where you get all those people skills magically, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that's, I mean, a typical path is through an MBA, or it can be through an MBA. And I mean, if that's the case, like for me, before I became a PM, I was a people manager. I managed an 80-person call center. I got my MBA. I'd done some development jobs before. And so by the time I got my first PM job, I'd been 8 years in career, you know, so I'd done a lot of work already. And that level of seniority is critical if you're going to be managing stakeholders across an organization. It's critical if you're going to be balancing business decisions, user decisions, influencing a team. Even though no one reports to most PMs, there is. I mean, there's a reason it's called product manager. It is a management role, even though you don't have a team. And so because of that, it's one reason I think the weight can fall a little bit to the PM at times. And so as a designer, it can be frustrating because you're seeing one slice of it, the design piece. But one of the hardest parts of being a PM is that you're going meeting to meeting to meeting, and you're kind of being pulled. It's like you're on the rack, and the designer says this, and the developer says, well, no, we got to focus on this. And then sales says, oh, this is a cool new idea. And then the CEO says, well, here's an initiative I need to do. And your job is to kind of make all that work. And so there's always someone angry at you, and it can be really frustrating. So a little empathy from designers can go a long way. Even if designers, it's something as simple as saying, cool, what's on your mind? It seems like there's a lot going on. I'd love to understand. I think that can make designers better at designing good solutions given all the constraints, because you shouldn't design just for the user and the experience there, but given the constraints and needs of the organization as well. So it becomes quite the calculus problem when you factor those in.
Yeah, indeed it does. It's a hard job being a PM.
It is. Thank you. It is a hard job.
Yeah. I mean, I remember having to fill in for you once. I think you took a 2-week vacation, and I learned that there was a lot that happens that I just let pile up until you got back.
Yep. I remember coming back and you said, okay, don't ever leave again. That's hard. And I was like, good. I'm glad you felt that, because it is hard. And I think vice versa, even though I think it's easier for designers to step in as a PM versus the other way around, just because of some of the visual skills that are involved. I think it's a good thing to have empathy for each other. Cool. So we've talked through roles and responsibilities, talked a bit about communication, spent some time on trust. Curious, as you think about main takeaways, or if someone was coming to you and said, man, this sucks, like this isn't working, what advice would you give kind of pulling this all together in terms of how do you approach this type of relationship better?
Yeah, if someone had a relationship that wasn't working, I would start by inviting them to understand what matters to their partner. So if I'm talking to the designer, invite them to talk to their product manager and figure out what matters to them, and try to do it in a way that's genuine and authentic and shows caring, and try to just see what's important to them, and then figure out how you can help, and then be honest about what you're looking for within your role too. If you want to just go onto a mountaintop and crank out, beautiful designs, let that be known. If you want to be a participant in the process and be able to give feedback on strategy and roadmap, make that clear and ask if there's things that you can do to kind of earn the right to be there. But I think starting with developing empathy for your partner is probably the kind of the starting point, which sounds kind of like a cheap cop out, but it is true.
Yeah. No, I think, understanding what matters to your partner is critical. 3 questions that I invite people to ask, and this is especially true when you onboard, but can be true even now if you're in the middle of a relationship, is number 1, how do you define how do you define success? Like, what does success look like for our product or for our work here? And I love asking people that question because, I mean, sometimes they haven't even thought about it or they don't articulate it very well or very often. Two, what's your role in that? Like, what do you do? What do you see your role is? And again, with product teams, there's a lot of ambiguity on, well, who does what, and it's different at different companies. So that's critical. And question number three is, what's stopping us today? Like, what's holding us back? What are some of the roadblocks, and how do we need to think about that? And just those three questions for me get to that understanding of what are your underlying goals, what matters to you, and can be a really good place to begin. Or if you're in a relationship, to revisit and say, hey, I heard these three questions. It'd be fun for us to answer these. Can be really helpful. So
awesome. Did we have any questions or comments come in throughout the feed today?
I don't think we have today. We had a few people on. People kind of ebbed and flowed. So hopefully it was a helpful discussion for people to listen to. And thinking about some of these more, I think, mushy parts of design and product management. But frankly, when these don't go well, I don't think much else matters because you're not aligned, you're fighting on things, misalignment leads to a whole bunch of other issues. So hopefully helpful things. And for me, I just hope that people know it can be a really good relationship and it's worth investing in. And that as you do that, as you make that relationship great, a lot of good things can come out that we all talk about of what are we paying attention to and how are we prototyping and testing and what analytics are we looking at? And let's actually ship products that impact our end users. So all that can come even better than if you don't care about the relationship.
Yeah, and I think for designers, it's probably a skill set or kind of something that just doesn't get talked about enough. Especially for designers who come from a more visual background, where they do approach. I mean, there are a lot of designers now who don't come from like an art background or something, right? That they have a little bit more of an eclectic background and history that maybe intuitively get that more. But and there's a lot of designers that just like to make really cool stuff. They're craftsmen, and it's difficult to let somebody kind of mess around with your craft.
Yeah,
because we do work on teams. This isn't a solo endeavor, and it does take work and it takes some skill to figure out the right way to manage and navigate that. So hopefully this is just a conversation that will help kind of propel that skill set forward, or at least bring awareness to the fact that those skill sets need to be developed.
Yep. Yeah. Agreed. Cool. Well, glad we could have the conversation today. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk. Hopefully we get to talk about this again another time. But
okay. Thanks, Ryan.
Yep. Talk about it. Bye.